And in the last few hours, multiple explosions have been reported.
War devastates.
Russia continuing its attacks on Ukraine before and during the summit in Alaska.
It destroys lives, countries, entire generations.
The fastest 12% loss, with the S&P down 7%.
And about 8%.
But here's the uncomfortable question nobody likes to ask. What does it do to your money? It feels almost heartless to think about. Who cares about my retirement account when thousands are suffering and dying? And yet, when chaos comes knocking, isn't it human nature to protect what we have? From World War I to Ukraine, and even the threat of a future war with China, the stock market has actually reacted in surprising ways. Today I want to break down exactly how conflict moves the market and what history predicts about the next big one. Grab a drink, because what I'm about to share shocked me, and it's already changing how I invest as our world faces violent challenges. Let's go back over 100 years. Leading up to World War I, things were going really well here in the US. Not perfectly, it never has been perfect, but the market was starting to really grow. Before World War I, when people said the stock market, they usually meant the Dow Jones Industrial Average, or the railroad averages. The data back then wasn't tracked like it is today, so historians had to reconstruct it using the Dow and big company stocks. It's not perfect, but it gives us a surprisingly accurate picture. In the 10 years before the war, the stock market grew about 78%, or 6% annualized. Not bad for an emerging world power that was taking over from England's dominance. Something interesting happened during the war though. Call it luck, or good fortune, or maybe it's America's cheat code when things go awry. By supplying the Allies with weapons, gear, and food, our economy here started to go parabolic. Between 1914 and 1918, the US market shot up 52%, or 11% per year on average. This set the stage for the United States being the country in the best position around the world when things go wild. In the decade following World War I, the US saw an average yearly return of 13.8%. This, of course, was the Roaring '20s bull market, a massive post-war boom that continued to cement the United States in the dominant position in the world. This doesn't compare to what happened next, though, as the whole world would be tested beyond anything ever seen before or since. The Great Depression shocked the world. Everyone was buying stocks without doing any research, creating a flywheel that was unsustainable, and the massive house of cards came crashing down. This still happens all the time today to individual investors. We just haven't seen it at the same scale since 1929. Just ask me about my Nikola stock, bought at $25 a share, and now they're worth, I think, 15 cents each. Oops. Looking at the entire decade, though, doesn't paint a great picture because it doesn't account for the gains that you get if you just always buy in. For example, if you put your whole fortune into the stock market in 1929 at the peak, yes, you would have lost 80% of your money, but almost nobody does that. The vast majority of people are dollar cost averaging, just putting money in as they get it, no matter what the economy is doing. So let's take two examples. John put in 100% of his money at the peak. Very unlikely. Sam puts in his money over time, the 5 years before the peak and the 5 years after the crash. So we're comparing lump sum investing at the worst possible moment and dollar cost averaging. Let's say both of them invested a total of $5,000. John, who invested at the worst time, would be left with $1,350 after 5 years. Pretty catastrophic. Sam, however, would be left with roughly $4,300. Not too bad considering it was the worst market crash our world has ever seen. By dollar cost averaging, Sam isn't doing too badly. He's only down about 15%. Let's see how they're both doing a decade in. By 1939, John would be at almost $2,000 in his portfolio, gaining back his losses, but still pretty catastrophic. Sam, however, would have benefited greatly from buying at the cheaper times during the crash. Keep in mind, many people are panicking during crashes and not buying at all. His portfolio would be at about $6,300. 10 years after the worst crash in history, his portfolio has completely recovered and given him some decent gains. That's without buying any additional stock after 1934. So if we look at the decade as a whole, it was catastrophic. But for the people who were dollar cost averaging, they did just fine. But what happened when World War II broke out? Once again, Europe erupted. The world was coming to an end. Millions upon millions of people would die in senseless violence. Well, initially the market dipped. People were afraid. We had just had a terrible decade, and now we were seeing the worst war in the history of the world. From 1939 to 1942, the market went down. By 1942, fear was everywhere. America had just been dragged into the bloodiest war in history.
I can see now, their infantry have advanced across the open cornfield and into the wood. Concentration behind the wood and one of our tanks there from my right.
And then something unexpected happened. The market flipped. From 1942 to 1945, stocks grew at a blistering 23% per year, and the US was officially cooking once again. The good times started to roll. The end of World War II started a new era for the stock market. War around the world would change, and the market would reflect it. This is where things get really interesting, and we start to see widespread greed mixed in with logic, and maybe just some good old-fashioned trying to do what's best for your finances.
In Korea, United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists.
The Korean War broke out pretty quickly after World War II. It was now pretty evident that no matter how large-scale a war would be, there would never truly be a war to end all wars. The stock market was also starting to mature at this point. People were getting interested in building and growth rather than strictly relying on their posterity to take care of them in old age. The market had been booming after World War II, but in 1950, people panicked once again as war broke out on the Korean peninsula. Pretty quickly though, people realized that this wouldn't be a war at the same scale as World War II. The market dropped 5% in just 2 days, but over the next few months it saw a full recovery. Not only was it a localized war, but the US economy and markets had matured. It was more resilient to war shocks. During the 3-year war, the stock market grew by 22%, 7% annually during a time of war. This was greater returns than during World War II. Things were changing. It was around this time that data started to get better. The S&P 500 was created, and people wanted growth. This was sort of a turning point in the US stock market. People started to realize that things were different now. The next decade of peace saw decent returns once again. 1955 to 1965, the yearly average was 7%. Not bad. Then once again, horrible news abroad. The Cold War is in full swing, and we're now at war in Vietnam. As many of you know, it was a very controversial war. The sense of duty to country that was everywhere during World War II was being challenged. Riots and turmoil domestically, while millions were being killed in a foreign land. With all of this going on, the market began to feel the burden. Weirdly enough, we still saw gains during this crazy time. Not wild gains, but gains nonetheless. Vietnam didn't crush the market the way you might expect, but here's the strange thing. While the war dragged on, it wasn't bombs that spooked investors most, it was inflation and oil shocks back home. The market actually did decently until 1973. A market downturn through 1974 saw many of the gains erased, but even then, with the slump, the decade ended with a total return of 12%. Finally, another period of peace between 1975 and 1990. The decade after Vietnam saw a total return of 56%. Then in the 5 years leading up to the Gulf War, things got wild again. 85% over 5 years, and then war breaks out in the Middle East. The market fell quickly by 18% as investors were spooked. The war was very quick and decisive though. Minimal US casualties, and by the end of 1991, the market had actually grown by 9%. Once again, an era of peace mixed in with high market returns. The next decade saw an average return of 12%. High wealth generating numbers. The Iraq War was a confusing time. Investors are quick to see historical patterns and jump on the bandwagon. It's sometimes why we can predict strong rallies, and it's also at times why we get recessions when people don't do their due diligence. I don't want to pretend like I know all the reasons that people do what they do. I think it's pretty obvious that the Iraq War and Great Recession sparked widespread greed. The Iraq War from 2003 to 2011 saw 5% annualized returns, but that doesn't tell the whole story. During that time, there was a massive downturn and recovery. Anyway, just know that we're glossing over a lot of history, data, and analysis here. If I make mistakes, I'll fix it in the pinned comment. Essentially though, the market did go up during this time, and in the decade after the war we saw massive returns of 11.5% annually. Our most modern example and data comes from a war that's still waging. One that's actually pretty close to home for me as I lived in that country for 5 years.
Russia fired more than 600 drones and missiles at targets across Ukraine earlier this morning.
In 2022, Russia initiated a full-scale invasion of my old home. I have many friends whose lives have been torn apart by this. This isn't exactly like the other wars we've gone over today, because the US has not put boots on the ground there. It's been a proxy war between NATO and Russia. The first major war in Europe since 1945. The market did react pretty sharply with an 18% decline in 2022, but once again, investors realized that this is the new normal. Profits can still be made. Once again, the market is booming. 2023 saw a 26% gain. 2024 saw a 25% gain. At the time of recording this, so far this year, the market is up 13%. It begs the question, are people profiting off war, following human nature, or is it somewhere in between? Defense stocks often rise when war breaks out. Government leaders buy stocks in companies that are about to get big government contracts. It makes me sick to my stomach when I really look into it deeply and see the corruption and greed. I also can't help but think that this isn't the whole picture. Human nature contracts when there's fear, and it breathes a sigh of relief when things stabilize. So here's the uncomfortable question to ask. Is it wrong to buy stocks when war breaks out, when history shows that wartime dips often result in massive gains? Or is it just being pragmatic? Whether it's corruption, greed, or just being smart. But things are heating up in the Pacific right now. If you follow world events, you know that China and Taiwan are building up stockpiles of weapons. Because of the nature of Taiwan's industry, this would drag the US and its allies into a conflict with China. It's devastating to even think about. Two nuclear powers at war with each other. We've never seen that before, and we don't know what it will do to society. My guess, though, is that the market would take a pretty big dive, and it would ultimately recover and make some people a lot of money. So we live in a world with a crappy reality. War happens, and it happens frequently. Killing has been industrialized, and that killing makes society freak out, which often makes the market dip, which makes a lot of people lose money. But some people, the ones who can control their emotions, make big profits. History is no magic oracle that shows the future, and this is by no means financial advice. There's a reason that investors always say, buy the dip. Red days might make your stomach churn, but that's when the productivity of society is on sale. So regardless of what goes on, I'm going to keep dollar cost averaging and try to stretch myself thin to buy dips when they happen, regardless of if it's from war or something else. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you haven't.